As a result, on the eve of the war, out of the 170 divisions and 2 brigades in the border military districts, 19 divisions had between 5,000 and 6,000 men each. The average strength of the 7 cavalry divisions was 6,000, while 144 divisions had 8,000 to 9,000 men each. In interior military districts, most divisions were undermanned, with many just being activated and beginning their combat training. I have already mentioned the high development rate of the Soviet tank-building industry and the quality of Soviet-made tanks. By 1938, the output of tanks more than tripled compared to the early 30s. In view of new national defense needs, the Central Committee of the Communist Party and the government tasked designers and tank builders with developing tanks that featured thicker armor, greater firepower, and high mobility. A team of talented designers under Zhuai Kotin developed the KV heavy tank, while another team under M.I. Koshkin, A.A. Morozov, and N.A. Kucherenko developed the famous T-34 medium tank. Engine builders created the powerful V2 diesel engine for tanks. The KV and T-34 were the best tanks built before the war and maintained their superiority over similar enemy tanks during the conflict. The task on the eve of the war was to organize their mass production as quickly as possible. The Defense Committee studied the situation in the tank industry at the direction of the Central Committee and reported that some plants did not fulfill production targets and had difficulties adjusting production processes. As a result, troops received the KV and T-34 tanks much too slowly. The government adopted appropriate measures. The Central Committee and the Council of People's Commissars made crucial decisions to organize mass production of tanks in the Volga area and the Urals. From January 1939 to June 22, 1941, the Red Army received over 7,000 tanks, with industry producing about 5,500 tanks of all types in 1941. However, the plants managed to produce only 1,861 KV and T-34 tanks before the war, which was clearly insufficient. New tanks began appearing in tank schools and border military districts only in the latter half of 1940. The insufficiency of battle-ready tanks was compounded by organizational difficulties. The Army pioneered the organization of large mechanized formations, brigades and corps. However, the experience of their employment in the specific conditions of the war in Spain was assessed incorrectly, leading to the disbandment of mechanized corps in our army. Despite this, we achieved significant success at Khalkhin Gol, where we employed tank formations. Powerful armoured formations were widely used by Germany in her aggressions against European countries, making it imperative to urgently raise large armour formations. In 1940, the activation of mechanized corps, tank, and motorized divisions began, with 9 mechanized corps formed. In February 1941, the General Staff drafted a broader plan to exceed the government's figures from 1940 for armour and mechanized units. Aware of the strength of the German armour, the People's Commissar for Defence and I requested that mechanized corps be raised from existing tank brigades and even cavalry units due to their mobility. Stalin, seemingly undecided, took until March 1941 to activate the 20 mechanized corps we had requested. However, we failed to correctly estimate the capacity of our tank industry, requiring 16,600 tanks of the latest types and a total of 32,000 tanks to fully equip the new mechanized corps. Such production levels could not be achieved within a year with the existing facilities. Technical and commanding personnel were also insufficient. We managed to equip less than half the corps before the war broke out. It was these corps that essentially repelled the first enemy blows. The corps, which were still in the formative stage at the outset of the war, were not fully prepared until the counteroffensive at Stalingrad, where they proved decisive. Confirmed archive records show that between January 1, 1939, and June 22, 1941, the Red Army received 29,637 field guns and 52,407 mortars, bringing the total number of artillery guns and mortars, including tank guns, to 92,578. This equipment was primarily organic to the units in the field, with border military districts receiving artillery strictly according to the tables of organization. Immediately before the war, we had 60 howitzer and 14 artillery regiments in the High Command Reserve, which was totally insufficient considering the specifics of the war with Germany. In the spring of 1941, we began forming 10 anti-tank artillery brigades, but failed to man them to the prescribed strength by June. Additionally, artillery pieces had inadequate traction to maneuver off the roads, particularly in autumn and winter. Nonetheless, the anti-tank artillery brigades proved exceptionally effective, sometimes being the only reliable weapon against massive panzer attacks from the enemy. Marshal G.I. Kulik, who was Stalin's chief rapporteur on artillery questions, did not always provide accurate assessments of the effectiveness of certain artillery and mortar systems. Towards the outbreak of the war, he and the Chief Artillery Division failed to appreciate the importance of the mighty BM-13 Katyushas, lorry-mounted multiple rocket launchers, whose salvos drove the enemy away in July 1941. The Defense Committee decided to initiate their batch production only in June of that year. Still, our arms experts deserve praise for their efficiency and diligence, as they did all they could to supply the troops with the first Katyushas within 10 to 15 days after the outbreak of war. Much more could have been done to produce mortars. The program was clear, as outlined in a decision issued by the Politburo of the Central Committee on January 30, 1940. However, the 82mm and 120mm mortars began to enter service in sufficient numbers only just before the war. Even in June 1941, our mortars outnumbered the German counterparts and proved technically superior. Stalin regarded artillery as the foremost weapon of war and paid considerable attention to its design and production. D.F. Ustinov was the People's Commissar for Armaments, B.L. Vanikov was the People's Commissar for Ammunition, and Generals Second Ivanov and V.G. Grabin were the chief designers of artillery systems. Stalin knew them all personally, often met with them, and trusted them completely. A commission established by the Central Committee of the Party and the Council of People's Commissars in the middle of 1940 rightly indicated that the strength of the engineer troops in peacetime was insufficient for their normal deployment in wartime. On the eve of the war, their numbers were enlarged, and new units were raised. The overall training of engineer troops was improved, as was the structure and operational makeup of the signals service. Signals chiefs in large units intensified efforts to make communications suitable for wartime conditions, with new equipment beginning to enter service. Yet we did not manage to rectify all the flaws in the engineer troops and the signals service before the war. Towards the end of February, the People's Commissar for Defence and I closely examined the building of fortified zones along the state border and the condition of railways, motor roads, earth roads, and communications facilities. Generals N.F. Vatutin, G.K. Malandin, and A.M. Vasilevsky reported on the state of affairs in detail. The following conclusions were drawn. The motor road network in West Byelorussia and West Ukraine was in poor condition. Many bridges could not support medium tanks and artillery guns, and earth roads required overhauling. My first deputy, Vatutin, reported to the People's Commissar on the condition of railways in all border military districts. Railway areas near the border, he reported, are ill-fitted for massive troop detrainment. This is borne out by the following figures. The German railways leading to Lithuania accommodate 220 trains a day, while our railway running from Lithuania in the direction of the border of East Prussia puts through only 84 trains. The situation in West Byelorussia and West Ukraine is no better. There our railway mileage is scarcely half that of the Germans. The railway troops and construction organizations will clearly fail to complete the work scheduled for 1941. The People's Commissar noted that in 1940, the Commissariat for Transport was instructed by the party's Central Committee to draft a 7-year plan for modernizing railways in the western part of the country. However, little significant progress had been made, aside from track alterations and preparing elementary railway facilities for the entrainment and detrainment of personnel and military freight. We knew that on February 18, 1941, D.G. Pavlov, commander of the Western Military District, had sent a message to Stalin, Molotov, and Timoshenko requesting considerable allocations for road building. The message stated in part, "I believe that the Western theatre of operations must be organized during 1941 by all means. Therefore, it is utterly impossible to drag out the construction over several years." Major General N.I. Gapich, the Red Army Chief of Signals, reported to us that there were shortages of the latest communication facilities and that mobilization and emergency equipment stockpiles were inadequate. The General Staff radio net had only 39% of the required RAT radio stations, 60% of the RAF, and 11 AK radio stations. There were only 45% of the required chargers. The Western Military District on the border had only 27% of the required radio stations. The respective figures for the Kiev and Baltic military districts were 30 and 52%. Other radio and wire facilities did not fare any better. Prior to the war, it was commonly believed that mainly the facilities of the People's Commissariat for Communications and those of the Ministry of Internal Affairs would be used to control the fronts, the interior military districts, and the High Command Reserve troops in the event of war. The communication centres of the High Command, the General Staff, and the fronts were to be provided with all requisites by local branches of the People's Commissariat for Communications, which later proved totally unprepared for wartime duty. I knew how local communications worked because, during field and staff exercises, they were leased to us. Even at that time, we doubted their ability to provide the armed forces with dependable communications in wartime. These circumstances caused the main fault in the training of commanders and staff personnel of large units and army formations, their lack of skill in controlling troops in fluid, rapidly changing combat situations. Commanders and staffs used wire rather than radio communications. What came of this at the outset of the war is commonly known. Inner radio communications in Air Force units, airfield networks, and tank units, where wire communications are totally unacceptable, were not effective enough. There was no underground cable network to service operational and strategic echelons. Urgent measures were imperative to put the telephone, telegraph, and radio networks into proper order. Nothing changed after discussing these matters with the People's Commissariat for Communications, not because someone was unwilling to do extra work. Better organization of communications was plainly necessary. The People's Commissariat simply could not physically meet the Army's demands. Everything done in late 1940 and early 1941 to improve local communications and links between certain centres and Moscow could not settle the problem. On hearing our reports, Timoshenko said, "I agree with your view of the situation, but I don't believe anything decisive can be done to eliminate all the defects. I saw Stalin yesterday. He received Pavlov's cable and said to tell him that although his demands were legitimate, we are not in a position to meet them." As I said earlier, the party and government always devoted much attention to the development of aviation. In 1939, the Defence Committee decreed the construction of 9 aircraft works and 7 aircraft engine works. The next year, another 7 civil industry plants were converted to aircraft production. The aircraft industry was provided excellent facilities. Production increased over 70% towards the close of 1940, as against the year before. More aircraft engine and aircraft instruments works were being built on sites turned over to the aircraft industry by other industries. According to the confirmed archive data, the Red Army received 17,745 combat planes, including 3,719 of the latest models, between January 1, 1939 and June 22, 1941. A new stage opened in aircraft construction. The Central Aero and Hydrodynamics Institute was almost entirely reconstructed. New combat aircraft design offices sprang up. Able designers such as S.V. Ilyushin, A.I. Mikoyan, S.A. Lavochkin, V.M. Petliakov, A.S. Yakovlev, and their teams of young experts came up with the Yak-1, MiG-3 and Lag-3 fighters, the Il-2 attack plane, the PE-2 dive bomber, and others, some 20 types in all. In late 1940 and early 1941, batch production was stepped up of the best types of aircraft. The party's Central Committee and Stalin gave much attention to aircraft designers. It can even be said that aviation was a kind of hobby with Stalin, but industry could not keep pace with the needs of the time. Old types of aircraft were still plentiful on the eve of the war. Some 80% of the planes were technically inferior to their German counterparts. New aircraft were still in the testing stage. Only 21% of the air units had been rearmed. True, the number of aircraft units multiplied. By June 1941, the total number of air regiments exceeded the 1939 figure considerably. The Air Division became the highest tactical formation of the fighter, attack, and bomber aircraft, mostly of mixed composition, each comprising 4 or 5 regiments, with each regiment consisting of 4 or 5 squadrons. Such organization of the Air Force ensured more efficient combat cooperation within the Air Force and with the land forces. Immediately before the war, the Air Force comprised 45% of bomber regiments, 42% of fighter regiments, and 13% of attack, reconnaissance, and other planes. At the end of 1940, the People's Commissar for Defense, the General Staff, and the Air Force Headquarters worked out recommendations on reorganization and re-equipment of the Air Force and submitted them to the party's Central Committee. They were duly endorsed. The resolution on reorganizing the Soviet Air Force provided for the activation of new units, 106 regiments, expansion and improvement of the Air Force school network, and re-equipment of combat formations with the latest planes. By the end of May 1941, we managed to form 19 regiments and equip them nearly to full strength. On April 10, 1941, the Central Committee of the Party and the USSR Council of People's Commissars decreed a reorganization of the Air Force Logistical Service on an area principle. Logistical agencies were detached from combat air units, air base areas were formed, and ground service battalions activated. Air base areas were made agencies of the Air Force logistics at Army, district, or front level. There were air bases per division, comprising ground service battalions, 1 per air regiment. Reconnaissance and ground forces support aviation retained their organic logistical installations. This more flexible logistical structure was to be introduced in July 1941. Yet in practice, we had to complete the innovation when the war was already in full swing. The need to increase the strength of the airborne troops was imposed by the nature of modern warfare. Activation of 5 airborne corps was started in April 1941. They were manned by June 1st, but combat equipment was insufficient. Therefore, only old airborne brigades united into new corps were battle-ready. Most of the personnel of the new formations were employed as infantry. The party's Central Committee and the Council of People's Commissars endorsed an extra plan for airfield construction, whereby 190 new airfields were to be sited in the western areas. By the outbreak of the war, construction was going full blast, but most airfields had not yet been completed. By and large, the Air Force was in the midst of far-reaching reorganization when the war broke out, going over to new planes and retraining the personnel, both flyers and ground crews. Few units were trained for flying in truly difficult conditions. Only 15% of flyers were trained for night flying. Air Force commanders, often too preoccupied with training the personnel to master new equipment, failed to maintain combat readiness on the old planes. Our Air Force could have been fully re-equipped and made much stronger in a mere year or year and a half. The danger of an air attack on the country was growing imminent in the pre-war years. Hence, the party's Central Committee demanded that air defence be made more effective and outlined concrete measures towards this end. First of all, important organisational measures were taken since the air defence system adopted in 1932 was considerably outmoded. The country's territory was divided into air defence zones within the then military districts. Each zone had units and formations for the defence of towns and military installations within its confines. The responsibility of military district commanders for air defence was enhanced. Aircraft organic to the District Air Force but detailed for air defence remained under the District Air Force Command. Unquestionably, it would have been better to provide single leadership and centralize control of air defense on a countrywide scale. But we did not accomplish this until the war was well underway in November 1941. How were the air defense forces armed? By June 1941, they had about 85% of their assigned medium-caliber guns and 70% of small-caliber. The shortage of fighter planes came to 40%, while anti-aircraft machine guns came to 70% of the quota, and barrage balloons and searchlights to something like 50%. Air defense forces in the western border districts and in Moscow and Leningrad were better armed. The western districts received new weaponry in greater amounts than other districts, were fitted out with anti-aircraft guns to the extent of 95%, and had new means for detecting and tracking an air enemy. The forces defending Moscow, Leningrad and Baku had over 40% of all the medium-caliber anti-aircraft batteries. Some 30 radar stations were located in the Leningrad and Moscow air defense zones. Acting on our report, the party's Central Committee and the Council of People's Commissars adopted a decision to form fighter corps to strengthen the air defense of Moscow and Leningrad. These corps played a very important role in warding off fascist air attacks on Moscow and Leningrad. At the time the war began, the new air defense system had not been properly lined up. Units had only begun acquiring and mastering the latest weaponry. Transport was in short supply. Before the war, the Navy had its own People's Commissariat. In the matter of the Navy's operational use, the Commissariat acted on the general operational and mobilization plans drawn up by the General Staff. After assuming the office of Chief of General Staff, given the short time that had passed, and being very busy with matters relating directly to the Red Army, I could not familiarize myself thoroughly with the state of the Navy. I knew, however, that the naval personnel had been well trained, and that the commanders of fleets and flotillas and their staffs were ready for combat. The Navy GHQ was headed at that time by Admiral Isakov, a gifted, resolute man with plenty of initiative. The build-up of the naval forces was being accelerated. The first 11 months of 1940 had seen the launching of 100 destroyers, submarines, minesweepers and torpedo boats, all of them highly effective in combat. Some 270 ships of all types were being built in 1940. New naval bases were being established, and regions in the Baltic, Barents and Black Sea were being assimilated. A modern navy is an expensive affair, especially the big ships, which are also good targets for attack from the air and for torpedoing. The Defense Committee of the USSR Council of People's Commissars correctly decided in 1939 to curtail and then stop altogether the building of battleships and heavy cruisers, which entailed immense expenditures and required great amounts of steel, besides diverting considerable numbers of engineers, technicians and workers of the shipbuilding industry. On the other hand, coast and air defense and mine and torpedo armaments were being neglected. The People's Commissariat of the Navy underestimated the importance of the Northern Fleet, which was destined to play a very big role in the war. On the whole, the Soviet Navy was impressive on the eve of the war and gave the enemy a fitting reception. The increase in the strength of our armed forces gives an idea of how seriously the party and government went about building up the country's defences from 1939 to 1941. During that period, the armed forces increased by 180%. 125 new divisions were formed, and by January 1, 1941, there were over 4,200,000 men in the ground, air, naval and air defence forces. In one of the earlier chapters, I touched slightly on the role of universal civil defence training. The tradition of training the civilian population, and above all the youth, for the defence of their motherland before being called up, was very popular among the public. By January 1, 1941, the organisation engaged in mass defence work, Osoaviakim, had a membership of over 13 million. Every year, tens of thousands of enthusiasts learned flying, parachute jumping, sharpshooting or aircraft repairs at the 300 or more flying and motor clubs, flying schools and glider clubs. How useful these skills were later to the volunteer opolchenie and the partisans. As for the professional training of commanders of all ranks, Hundreds of thousands of them received a good schooling in the 200 military schools of the Red Army and Navy, the 19 academies, the 10 military departments at civil institutes, and the 7 higher naval schools. On the occasions that I visited the General Staff Academy, which was under my supervision, I could yet again satisfy myself that on the eve of the war, modern military theory was being presented to students in lectures, literature, training plans, and aids, taking into account much of the experience of the already ongoing Second World War. Emphasis was placed on the relentlessness and bitterness of the armed struggle, on the possibility of it being drawn out, and the necessity of mobilizing the efforts of the entire nation and uniting front and rear in the struggle. Military strategy was chiefly based on the correct assertion that an aggressor can only be defeated by offensive operations. Yet other variations, meeting engagements, forced retreat, fighting when encircled, and night fighting, were not examined solidly enough. On the whole, the military theory of that time was basically up to the mark. Still, practice lagged behind theory to a certain extent. Looking into operational strategic questions, I concluded that in the defence of such an immense country as ours, there were a number of serious faults. This was also the opinion of the leading personnel of the General Staff. They informed me that my predecessors in this office had spoken to the same effect on many occasions. The concentration of large numbers of German troops in East Prussia, Poland, and the Balkans caused us particular anxiety. We were also disturbed by the inadequate combat readiness of our armed forces in the western military districts. After reflecting on these questions, N.F. Vatutin and I informed the People's Commissar for Defence in detail about the flaws in the organisation and combat readiness of our troops, particularly regarding the state of the mobilization supplies, especially shells and bombs. We also pointed out that industry was behind in fulfilling our arms orders. Again, Timoshenko remarked, "The leadership knows all that very well. I don't think that at present the country can give us anything more." One day he called me in and said, "Yesterday I saw Stalin about the lorry-mounted multiple rocket launchers. He wanted to know if you had taken over from Meretskov and how you felt about your new job. He asked you to report to him in a couple of days." "What is he likely to ask me about?" "Everything," said the People's Commissar. "But remember that he won't listen to long reports. What it takes you several hours to tell me, you must tell him in 10 minutes. What can I tell him in 10 minutes? These are serious questions and call for serious consideration. Their importance has to be understood and the necessary measures taken." "He knows for the most part what you want to tell him," Timoshenko said, "so try to concentrate on the key problems." On Saturday night, I went to Stalin at his country cottage, taking along a list of the questions I wanted to raise. I found there Marshal Timoshenko, Marshal Kulik, and some members of the Politburo. After greeting me, Stalin asked if I was familiar with the Katyusha rocket launchers. "I've only heard about them, but I haven't seen them," I said. "Then Timoshenko, Kulik, and Abarenkov must take you to the testing grounds in the next few days so you can see them fired. Now tell us how things are at the General Staff." I briefly repeated what I had already reported to Timoshenko, stating that, in view of the gravity of the military and political situation, urgent measures must be taken to eliminate the flaws in the defence of the western border and in the armed forces. Molotov interrupted me, saying, "So you think we'll have to fight the Germans soon?" Stalin motioned for him to keep silent. After listening to what I had to say, Stalin asked us all to the dinner table, and the interrupted conversation continued. Stalin wanted to know what I thought of the German Air Force. The German Air Force is not bad. The flying personnel have had good practice in coordinating action with the ground forces. As for the aircraft, our new fighters and bombers are not a bit worse than the Germans, and perhaps even better. It's too bad, however, that they are so few. "Fighter planes are especially few," Timoshenko added. Someone remarked sarcastically, "Timoshenko thinks more of defence aviation." The People's Commissar did not answer. He was hard of hearing, and simply may not have heard the remark. Dinner was simple. We had thick Ukrainian borscht, followed by well-cooked buckwheat porridge and boiled meat, and then by stewed and finally fresh fruit. Stalin was in high spirits and joked a lot. He was drinking the light Georgian Kovanchkara wine and pressed it on the others, but most of them preferred brandy. At the end, Stalin said the most important questions would have to be examined and worked out, and submitted to the government for decision. But in doing so, we ought to proceed from our actual capabilities, and not make wild proposals that were unrealistic at the moment due to our lack of means. When I returned to the General Staff, I jotted down everything Stalin had said, and picked out the questions that would have to be tackled first. These proposals were put before the government. The 18th All-Union Party Conference, which I had the occasion to attend, was held from the 15th to 20th of February 1941. The conference called on party organisations to give serious attention to the needs of industry and transport, particularly to the defence enterprises. Demands were increased. It was pointed out in the conference resolutions that the heads of the People's Commissariats for Aviation, Chemicals, Ammunition, Electrical Appliances, and a number of other industries of importance for defence must take their cue from the criticism at the conference and substantially improve their work. Otherwise, they would be removed from their posts. The economic plan for 1941 adopted by the conference, the last peacetime plan, provided for a considerable expansion of the defence industry. At the conference, many military men were elected alternate members of the Central Committee or members of the Central Auditing Commission, among them I.V. Tulenev, M.P. Kirponos, I.S. Yumashev, V.F. Tributes, and F.S. Oktyabrski. Great confidence was also placed in me. I was elected alternate member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. Immediately before the war, the generals and officers working on our General Staff formed a compact, friendly, and close-knit team of competent and experienced men. I will name only a few of them. The first Deputy Chief of General Staff was Lieutenant General N.F. Vatutin, a man of exceptional industry and broad strategic thinking. The Deputy Chief of General Staff for Organizational Matters was Lieutenant General V.D. Sokolovsky, appointed to this post at the beginning of spring 1941, before which he had been Chief of Staff of the Moscow Military District. During the war, Sokolovsky displayed great talent and the abilities of an outstanding military leader. The Operations Division was headed by Major General G.K. Malandin, a highly educated and competent man. Major General A.M. Vasilevsky was also working in operations. During the war, he proved himself to be an outstanding commander. A number of the most important and brilliant operations were carried out under his guidance. Shortly before the war, Vasilevsky was working on the operational plan for the northwest and western directions. Besides the generals I have named, there were a number of other capable and energetic commanders on the General Staff who contributed to the high efficiency of the entire personnel. The General Staff performed colossal operational, organizational and mobilization work, and was the main machinery of the People's Commissariat for Defence. Still, there were flaws in the work of the General Staff. When we looked into the state of affairs in the spring of 1941, for example, we found that neither the General Staff nor the People's Commissariat for Defence and the commanders of arms and services had prepared command posts from which they could direct the armed forces in case of war, quickly hand down directives from the High Command, and receive and process reports from the troops. During the pre-war years, the construction of command posts was neglected. When war began, the High Command, the General Staff, the staffs of all the arms of the service, and the central divisions had to control operations from their peacetime offices, which greatly hampered their work. At the beginning of the war, questions concerning the High Command had not been settled as concerned its structure, personnel, location, and logistic support. During the 5 years preceding the war, there had been 4 chiefs of General Staff. Such frequent changes of leadership made it impossible fully to develop the country's defence and give deep consideration to all aspects of the coming war. What were the main questions the General Staff was working on during those months? Some writers of war memoirs maintain that before the war we had no mobilization plans and no plans for tactical and strategic deployment. In reality, of course, the General Staff had operational and mobilization plans. We never stopped working on them and bringing them up to date. After each revision, they were immediately reported to the country's leadership, and upon approval, they were made known to the military districts. On the eve of the war, the Operations Division, Generals Malandin, Vasilevsky, Anisov, and others, did much work on the operational and mobilization plans. Before I was appointed to the General Staff, overall guidance in developing plans came from Marshal of the Soviet Union Shaposhnikov, and later from General of the Army Meretskov and Lieutenant General Vatutin. In the autumn of 1940, the previous operations plan was thoroughly revised and brought in line with the objectives that would face us in the event of an attack. True, there were strategic mistakes in the plan, stemming from an erroneous conception. As we saw it, the most dangerous strategic direction was the southwestern, the Ukraine, and not the western, Byelorussia, where the Hitler High Command concentrated and engaged its most powerful ground and air formations in June 1941. Yet the western direction was the shortest route to Moscow. As a consequence, the 19th Army and a number of units and formations of the 16th Army concentrated in the Ukraine were rushed to the west and went into action immediately as part of the Western Front. This undoubtedly affected the defense operations in the west. When revising the operations plan in the spring of 1941, February-April, we failed to eliminate all the effects of this mistake and did not lay down a large enough force in the western sector. Stalin was convinced that in the war against the Soviet Union, the Nazis would first try to seize the Ukraine and the Donetsk coal basin in order to deprive the country of its most important economic regions and lay hands on the Ukrainian grain, Donetsk coal, and later Caucasian oil. During the discussion of the operational plan in the spring of 1941, Stalin said, "Nazi Germany will not be able to wage a major lengthy war without those vital resources." Stalin was the greatest authority for all of us, and it never occurred to anybody to question his opinion and assessment of the situation. Yet his conjecture as to the main strike of the Nazi invader proved incorrect. The last version of the mobilization plan, concerning organization and logistics, was approved in February 1941 and designated as MP41. It was handed down to the districts with instructions to correct the preceding mobilization plans accordingly by May 1, 1941. In 1940, it had been decided to move some troops of the western districts to the western regions recently reunified with the Soviet Union. Although those regions had not yet been duly prepared for defense, the first echelons of troops from the western military districts were deployed there. Here I would like to dwell on the fate of the old and new fortified areas, FAs. The construction of new FAs on the western frontier had started in early 1940 under a project approved by Stalin based on Voroshilov's and Shaposhnikov's report. The building of the fortified areas was not completed by June 1941. By the time the war began, some 2,500 reinforced concrete structures had been set up, 1,000 being equipped with appropriate fortified area artillery, and the other 1,500 having only machine guns. As for the Ukraine, the Rava-Ruskaya and Peremyshal areas were best prepared for combat in June 1941, and they played a commendable part in the fighting of the first days of the war, which will be described later in the book. At this point, I think it is relevant to elucidate the removal of artillery from the old fortified areas. In February and March 1941, the Chief Military Council of the Red Army met twice to discuss how it could accelerate the construction and equipment of the new FAs. I remember the heated debates that arose at the sittings. But spirited as they were, these disputes did not yield any practical solution to speed up the manufacture of FA guns and equipment. This was why Marshal Kulik, Deputy Defense Commissar for Armaments, Marshal Shaposhnikov, Deputy Defense Commissar for FAs, and Zhdanov, a member of the Chief Military Council, proposed that part of the required armaments be transferred from some old FAs to those under construction. Marshal Timoshenko and I objected, pointing out that the old fortified areas, FAs, might still be needed. Besides, the guns in the old FAs did not fit the new fortifications in design. Due to the controversy among Chief Military Council members, the issue was reported to Stalin. He supported Kulik, Shaposhnikov, and Zhdanov, and accordingly gave orders to dismantle part of the artillery in second-rate sectors and move it to the western and southwestern areas, adapting the constructively outdated guns to the new fortifications, at least temporarily. The old FAs had been built between 1929 and 1935. The permanent emplacements were mostly provided with machine guns only. In 1938 to 1939, some of them were reinforced with artillery systems. By the decision of the Red Army Chief Military Council on November 15, 1939, the authorized strength of the old fortified areas was to be reduced by more than one-third. Now it was decided to remove artillery from some sectors. However, after another report to Stalin, we were given permission to keep part of the artillery in the sectors in question. In connection with the FAs, whose construction began in 1938 and 1939, the General Staff dispatched directives on April 8, 1941, to the Western and Kiev Special Military Districts, which read in part, pending special instructions, the Slutsk, Sebezh, Shepetovka, Isyaslavl, Starokonstantinovka and Ostropolia fortified areas are to be maintained in their present state. In order to ensure operability of the above areas in wartime, the following measures are to be implemented. 1. Train commanding personnel for fortified areas. 2. In order to complete the system of artillery and machine gun fire, determine in each defence centre and strongpoint the sites of log and earth or stone and concrete emplacements to be built within the first 10 days of war by field forces. 3. On the basis of designs and technical specifications issued by the Red Army Defensive Works Department, calculate the required amount of weapons and elementary interior equipment. 4. In calculating manpower, means, and the scale of work, take into account the ferro-concrete structures set up in 1938 to 1939 in the Letichev, Mogilev, Yampol, Novograd-Volynski, Minsk, Polotsk, and Mozyr fortified areas. 5. The head of the Defensive Works Department is to work out and dispatch to the districts by May 1, 1941, technical specifications on the installation of the artillery pieces and elementary interior equipment in the 1938 to 1939 fortifications. It follows from the aforesaid that an error in timing occurred in bringing the weaponry of the fortifications on the old state frontier to readiness for combat. The General Staff directive required them to be combat-worthy by the 10th day of the war, whereas in fact many points in the old FAs were captured by the enemy before the 10th day. The FAs along the old frontier had not been dismantled and wholly disarmed, as claimed in some war memoirs and historical works. They had been essentially kept intact in the more important sectors and were to have been reinforced. However, developments in the first few days of the war prevented us from carrying out all the contemplated measures and using the old FAs more effectively. As for the new fortified areas, the People's Commissariat for Defence and the General Staff repeatedly urged the military districts to intensify their construction. Some 140,000 people were engaged daily in putting up fortifications along the new frontier. I would like to quote a General Staff directive of April 14, 1941, on this matter. Despite a number of instructions issued by the Red Army General Staff, the work of installing casemate artillery in hardened emplacements and putting said emplacements in combat readiness is proceeding at an impermissibly slow pace. The People's Commissar for Defence orders that 1. All the available FA weaponry in the given district be immediately mounted in combat emplacements and the latter be put in combat readiness. 2. In the absence of special armaments, it is essential that machine guns on field mounts and, where possible, guns be installed temporarily in embrasure openings and portholes. 3. Emplacements be put in combat readiness even if the rest of the authorized equipment is not available, but mounting armoured, metal and grated doors is absolutely necessary. 4. Proper care and maintenance of armaments installed in emplacements be provided for. 5. The head of the Red Army Defensive Works Department shall immediately dispatch to the districts technical specifications on the installation of provisional armaments in ferro-concrete bunkers. Progress reports are to be sent to the Red Army General Staff by April 25, 1941. Signed, General of the Army G. Zhukov, Chief of the Red Army General Staff. Certified, Major General S. Shiryaev, Head of the Fortified Areas Department of the Red Army General Staff. In March 1941, the General Staff completed the mobilization plan for the munition industry in the event of war. General Sokolovsky, Deputy Chief of General Staff, and I submitted this plan to the Chairman of the Defence Committee under the Council of People's Commissars. A special memorandum on ammunition was drawn up by the General Staff and addressed to the Party Central Committee and the Council of People's Commissars. The memorandum concerned the supply of shells and mines. There was a shortage of howitzer, anti-aircraft and anti-tank shells. Shells for the latest artillery systems were disastrously low. Stalin handed on our memorandum for the Ammunition Commissariat and the Commissariat for Defence to examine and deliver an opinion. N.A. Voznesensky and other comrades found our demands somewhat exaggerated and told Stalin that the request for 1941 should be met to the extent of 20% at the most. Stalin agreed. After several more memos, however, Stalin issued a special decision on considerably extending the manufacture of ammunition in the second half of 1941 and early 1942. During the spring of 1941, the central supply bodies under the People's Commissariat for Defence were working hard to increase the emergency stock of fuel, foodstuffs, clothing and equipment in all the western frontier districts at the expense of the state reserves. The district ammunition depots were substantially replenished from Defence Commissariat stocks. The People's Commissar for Defence and the General Staff, myself included, thought it necessary, in view of the imminent war, to bring the materiel closer to the troops. What seemed correct, however, turned out to be a mistake due to the developments of the first few weeks of the war. The enemy breached our defences and swiftly seized the depots of the districts with all that was stored in them, which badly complicated the supply of troops and the activation of reserves. In revising the operational plans in spring 1941, little attention was given to the new methods of warfare at the initial stage of hostilities. The People's Commissar for Defence and the General Staff believed that war between countries as large as Germany and the Soviet Union would follow the old scheme. The main forces engage in battle after several days of frontier fighting. Regarding concentration and deployment deadlines, it was assumed that conditions for the two countries were the same. In fact, however, the forces and conditions proved to be far from equal. What was Germany's economic potential when it attacked the Soviet Union? Having seized control over practically all economic and military strategic resources of Europe, Germany had given its armed forces modern weapons and combat equipment, along with sufficient material facilities. The absence of actively operating forces in Western Europe at the time gave the Nazis a chance to concentrate the bulk of their troops against the Soviet Union. On the eve of the war, Germany was producing 31.8 million tons of steel a year, including the occupied countries, and 257.4 million tons of coal, 439 million together with its satellites. The Soviet Union's output amounted to 18.3 million and 165.9 million tons, respectively. Germany's weak point was oil production, although this was somewhat compensated by importing Romanian oil, previously built-up reserves, and synthetic fuels. Unscrupulously trampling the Versailles limitations, the Hitler leadership, in pursuance of its aggressive plans, subordinated the country's economic policy to the interests of its contemplated aggressive war. German industry was completely attuned to war. All other considerations receded to the background. Germany built up a mighty military and economic potential. In a relatively short period, more than 300 large munition works were established. The war industry output in 1940 rose by 2/3 over 1939 and 22 times over 1932. In 1941, German industry turned out over 11,000 planes, 5,200 tanks and armoured vehicles, more than 7,000 guns of 75 mm and more, and some 1.7 million carbines, rifles and submachine guns. one should remember the large stocks of armaments requisitioned in other countries and the industrial power of Germany's satellites and the occupied countries. At the end of March 1941, the Soviet government learned that Japan's Foreign Minister Yosuke Matsuoka was having highly secret talks with Ribbentrop and the military leaders of the Nazi Reich in Berlin. Nothing was simpler than guessing the nature of these negotiations. Hitler was trying to encircle the USSR militarily by forming a bloc of Germany and imperialist Japan. This meant, in effect, that the Soviet Union would have to fight on two fronts. Hence, ensuring the Soviet Union's security in the West was not only a question of guaranteeing military security, but also of mobilizing all available resources to confront the danger of an imperialist war. Therefore, we had to pay more attention to the military build-up of our western districts, not only to improve the state of the fortified areas, but also to create a reserve of troops and armaments, ammunition and equipment in them. This was a crucial condition for ensuring the readiness of the Soviet armed forces to repel any threat from Germany. The enemy carried out large-scale preparations for the combat theatre, which included laying second railway tracks in Slovakia and Romania, extending the system of airfields and landing grounds, intensively building munition depots. In towns and industrial enterprises, they organized air defense training, built bomb-proof shelters, and conducted trial mobilizations. Of the Hungarian troops, up to 4 corps were stationed in Carpathian Ukraine, while a sizable part of the Romanian troops were in the Carpathians. In Finland, from April 10th to 29, up to 22,000 German troops disembarked at the port of Abo, Turku, and headed for Rovaniemi and Kirkenes. General Golikov believed that further German reinforcements were likely to arrive with troop contingents that had completed their assignments in Yugoslavia. By spring 1941, the Nazis had no fear of serious action from their Western opponents. Consequently, the bulk of the German armed forces was concentrated from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The intelligence service reported that as of June 1, 1941, up to 120 German divisions were positioned against the USSR. By June 1941, Germany's armed strength totaled approximately 8,500,000, an increase of 3,550,000 since 1940, with the number of divisions reaching 214. Our armed forces numbered over 5 million at that time, including additional contingents called up. Hitler believed this was the most opportune moment to attack the Soviet Union. The Nazi command began mass-scale troop transports eastward on May 25, 1941. By this time, the railways had been put on full-capacity schedules. Between May 25th and mid-June, a total of 47 German divisions, including 28 panzer and motorized divisions, were moved to the Soviet border. Regarding our own preparations, throughout March and April 1941, the General Staff was busy finalizing plans for covering the western frontier and the war mobilization plan. When finalizing the frontier plan, we reported to Stalin that, in our estimation, the troops of the Baltic, Western, Kiev, and Odessa districts would not be able to repel a German onslaught. We recommended the immediate mobilization of several armies from interior military districts to be moved in early May to the Baltic coast, Byelorussia, and Ukraine as a precaution. After repeated requests, we were finally allowed, under the guise of mobile training camps, to transport 2 infantry armies of reduced strength to Ukraine and another 2 to Byelorussia. We were strictly warned to exercise extreme caution and maintain operational secrecy. At this time, Stalin ordered the acceleration of the construction of basic and field airdromes, but the workforce was not available until after the spring farm work. Stalin later inquired about the progress of the reservist call-up. The People's Commissar for Defense reported that the draft was proceeding normally, and the frontier districts would receive reinforcements towards the end of April. He added that refresher training for the called-up contingents would begin in early May. On May 13th, the General Staff issued a directive for interior military districts to shift troops westward. The 22nd Army was moved from the Urals to Velikiye Luki, the 21st Army from the Volga to Gomel, the 19th Army from the North Caucasus to Belaya Tserkov, the 25th Rifle Corps from the Kharkov district to the western Dvina, and the 16th Army from Transbaikal to Shepetovka in Ukraine. In total, 28 rifle divisions and 4 army commands were moved in May from interior military districts closer to the western frontier. Unfortunately, their strength ranged from 8,000 to 9,000, and they lacked all assigned weapons. In late May, the General Staff instructed the commanders of frontier districts to immediately prepare command posts and station front commands by June 20th under the following scheme: the Northwestern Front at Panevėžys, the Western Front at Obūz-Lesna, the Southwestern Front in Ternopil, the Odessa District Command, as an army command, in Tiraspol. The front and army field commands were to move into these areas by June 21st, 22. Along the state frontier we had 47 land and 6 naval frontier guard detachments, 9 separate frontier commandants' offices, 11 regiments of the Internal Affairs Commissariat's operational troops, a number of rifle divisions, the first echelons of the covering force of military districts, stationed near the frontier but not deployed for combat. Overall, the western frontier districts and fleets numbered 2.9 million men, over 1,500 modern aircraft, a large number of obsolete planes, about 38,000 guns and mortars, 1,475 new KV and T-34 tanks, and a considerable number of obsolete light tanks with limited engine characteristics, some of which required repairs. The combat training in the frontier districts varied due to many different factors. It is now challenging to recall the specifics of the atmosphere that reigned there on the eve of the war. I remember reflecting on the Kiev Special Military District, which I had just left to take up my duties with the General Staff. How did things stand there? In this regard, I would like to cite a few passages from the memoirs of Marshal Bagramyan, who was then a colonel and head of the Kiev district operations. His words accurately depict the situation in the army and the difficulties faced during the last few pre-war months. No sooner had we seen our commander off to the 18th Party Conference, he writes, than the General Staff urgently summoned to Moscow the chief of the district staff and the group of generals and officers who participated in drawing up the plan for covering the state frontier. In Moscow, everything became clear. We were to take part in discussing operational measures for the district. Our work was underway when we were suddenly told to return to Kiev at once and resume our current duties. Back in Kiev, we first had to examine the army plans for covering the state frontier, which had been developed by the army staffs based on instructions received from the district command. To our great satisfaction, the army plans needed no serious revision. We only had to make insignificant corrections. However, shortly afterwards, immediately after the Nazis seized Yugoslavia, the General Staff instructed us to make a number of important changes to the plan. The district command was ordered to substantially increase the troop contingent assigned to covering the state frontier. General Kirponos was disappointed at what he perceived as a weakening of the reserve group of his troops. In his opinion, too large a force was assigned to passive defence. But orders were orders. On April 18th, we instructed the armies to incorporate these changes into the plan. The chiefs of army staffs and officers working on the plans were again summoned to district headquarters, and again things began to hum. The fact that the generals and officers had to handle every small paper themselves considerably delayed the work. The revision of the plans was to be completed by May 10th. Luckily, those were the last major changes. Otherwise, we would never have finished the plans before the Nazi invasion. In the latter half of April, the Red Army leadership began to visibly reinforce the state frontier districts. On April 26th, as I recall, we received orders from Moscow to form 5 mobile artillery anti-tank brigades and an airborne corps by June 1st. 4 of our rifle divisions were to be transformed into Alpine rifle divisions. The district command was informed that by May 25th, the 31st Rifle Corps Command would arrive from the Soviet Far East to join the local troops. The last month of spring brought us no thaw in international relations. Stalin's unexpected appointment as chairman of the Council of People's Commissars was understood by everyone at District HQ as evidence of a further aggravation of international affairs. For the first time in Soviet history, party and state leadership was consolidated in one person's hands. There were other signs of the rapidly growing danger. In the latter half of May, a directive from the General Staff obliged the district command to receive and quarter troops from the North Caucasian Military District, the 34th Rifle Corps Command and Corps units, 412, 000 strong rifle divisions, and an Alpine Rifle Division. An operational group headed by Lieutenant General M.A. Reiter, second in command of the North Caucasian District, was to assume charge of these troops. The same directive stated that the troops would commence arriving on May 20th. Although not unexpected, the directive posed a challenge for the command. Quartering almost an entire army in a short time was no easy task, leading us to postpone the command and staff exercise scheduled for the latter half of May. Train after train began to arrive at the end of May. The operations department transformed into a control office for all information regarding the movement and condition of the troops coming from the North Caucasian Military District. I recall a typical incident. Commanders appointed to the arriving divisions noted that all formations had only peacetime complements and were consequently short of a significant number of officers, men, and materiel, especially transport and communication facilities, which the divisions were to receive upon mobilization. This was evidently due to a desire to adhere to the letter of the treaty with Nazi Germany. Anticipating events, I should note that when the war began, these divisions were rushed to the western strategic sectors and immediately sent into action. Hardly had the 5 divisions from the North Caucasian Military District completed concentration in our district when the General Staff informed us in early June that, under the directive of the People's Commissar for Defense, the 19th Army Command had been formed and was to arrive in Cherkasy by June 10th. The Army would incorporate the 5 divisions of the 34th and 3 divisions of the 25th Rifle Corps of the North Caucasian Military District, headed by Lieutenant General I.S. Konev, commander of the North Caucasian Military District. The following day, the General Staff notified the District Command that another force, the 16th Army under Lieutenant General M.F. Lukin from Transbaikalia, was to be received and quartered. The plan provided for the concentration of General Lukin's troops within the territory of the Kiev Special Military District between June 15th and July 10th. Thus, we had to receive and quarter a second army on very short notice. This was gratifying, as the apprehension that, in the event of war, we would have no troops in depth was alleviated. It was clear that the Defence Commissar and the General Staff had ensured that orders were given to prepare for the movement of all district forces to the frontier. Now, I believe it is time to discuss the main error of that period, which naturally gave rise to many others, the miscalculation in determining the probable date of the German forces' attack. The 1940 operational plan, which was finalized and in force in 1941, stated that in the event of a threat of war, 1. All armed forces are to be alerted. 2. Troop mobilization is to be carried out immediately on a nationwide scale. 3. Troops are to be built up to wartime strength under the mobilization plan. 4. All mobilized troops are to be concentrated and deployed along the western frontier in accordance with the plans of the frontier military districts and the military high command. Measures specified by the operational and mobilization plans could only be implemented by a special government decision. This was granted, and partially at that, only in the early morning of June 22, 1941. In the last few pre-war months, the leadership did not call for any steps that should have been taken when the threat of war was particularly great. One cannot help asking why the leadership, headed by Stalin, did not put through the operational plan they themselves had endorsed. More often than not, people blame Stalin for these errors and miscalculations. He had certainly made mistakes, but one cannot consider the causes of these mistakes in isolation from the objective historical processes and phenomena, from the entire complex of economic and political factors. Now that the consequences are known, nothing is easier than to return to the beginning and expound all sorts of opinions. and nothing is more difficult than to probe to the substance of the problem in its entirety, the battle of various forces, the multitude of opinions and facts at the given moment in history. Comparing and analysing Stalin's conversations with people close to him in my presence, I have come to the firm conclusion that all his thoughts and deeds were prompted by the desire to avoid war, and that he was confident in succeeding. Stalin was well aware of what misfortunes would befall the Soviet people in a war with such a strong and wily enemy as Nazi Germany. That was why he strove, as our entire party did, to win time. It is now common knowledge that there had been warnings of the attack on the USSR that the Nazis were about to unleash, of the troops that were being massed on our borders, and so on. But at that time, as we see from enemy archives captured after the defeat of Nazi Germany, reports of quite a different nature landed on Stalin's desk as well, and in large numbers. Here is an example. On February 15, 1941, acting on instructions from Hitler given at a conference on February 3, 1941, Field Marshal Keitel, Chief of Staff of the High Command, issued a special directive for misinforming the enemy. To conceal the preparations for Operation Barbarossa, the Intelligence and Counterintelligence Division of the General Staff evolved and carried out numerous operations, spreading false rumours and false information. It was leaked that the movement of troops to the east was part of the greatest misinformation manoeuvre in history, designed to distract attention from final preparations for the invasion of England. Maps of England were printed in vast quantities. English interpreters were attached to units. Preparations were made for sealing off some coastal areas along the English Channel, the Strait of Dover, and Norway. Rumours were spread about an imaginary airborne corps. Mock-ups of rocket batteries were installed along the shore, and rumours circulated among the troops that they were being sent east for a rest before the invasion of England, and others that they would be allowed to pass through Soviet territory to attack India. To add credibility to the tale of a landing in England, special operations were worked out under code names Shark and Harpoon. The flood of propaganda was directed against England, and the usual diatribes against the Soviet Union ceased. Diplomats did their bit, and so forth. Superimposed on the deficiencies in the general combat readiness of the Soviet armed forces, such information explains the extreme caution Stalin displayed when it came to carrying out the basic preparations provided for in the operational and mobilization plans for repulsing possible aggression. Stalin was also aware of the fact that, as I have already mentioned, owing to the shift from the territorial to the cadre system of command, units and formations were headed by young commanders and political officers who had not yet acquired the operational and tactical skill required for the posts they held. Acting on the decisions of the 18th Party Congress and subsequent instructions of the party's Central Committee on the selection, education and training of leading cadres, the command and the party and political bodies in the army had, by the summer of 1941, carried out a vast amount of training and educational work, which raised the general theoretical level and practical skills of cadres in all arms of the service. Nevertheless, the question of the armed forces commanding personnel remained a serious problem in 1941. The mass promotion of young commanders to high posts lowered the army's fighting capacity for a certain time. When important and major organizational measures were carried out shortly before the war, the shortage of skilled commanders, specialists, tank men, gunners, flyers and ground crews made itself felt quite clearly. The substantial increase in the strength of our armed forces made the shortage even more perceptible. It was assumed that this could, for the most part, be overcome by the end of 1941. While wishing to preserve peace as the decisive condition for building socialism in the USSR, Stalin saw that the governments of Britain and other Western countries were doing everything possible to prod Hitler into a war with the Soviet Union. Being in a critical military situation and striving to save themselves from catastrophe, they were strongly interested in having the Germans attack the USSR. That was why Stalin distrusted the information he was getting from Western governments that Germany was about to attack the Soviet Union. Let me recall a set of facts which, when reported to Stalin, were likely to heighten his distrust of the above warnings. I mean the secret negotiations with Nazi Germany in London in 1939, precisely when Britain, France and the USSR were holding military talks in Moscow. British diplomats were offering the Nazis an agreement on dividing spheres of influence on a world scale. The British Minister of Trade, Hudson, said during his talks with Voltat, a Nazi privy councillor close to Field Marshal Goering, that 3 extensive regions offering unlimited opportunities for economic activity, the British Empire, China and Russia, were open to the two countries. They discussed political and military issues, problems of procuring raw materials for Germany and the like. Other persons joined the talks. The German ambassador in London, Dirksen, confirmed in his report to Berlin the existence of a tendency towards constructive policy among government quarters here. Here I think it relevant to recall that when Hitler tried to offer the Soviet Union to discuss the idea of dividing the world into spheres of influence, he encountered a sharp and unequivocal refusal from the Soviet side, which would not even hear of the subject. This is borne out by documents and by the evidence of those who accompanied V.M. Molotov on his visit to Berlin in November 1940. As is commonly known, Winston Churchill sent Stalin a message at the end of April 1941, which read in part, "I have sure information from a trusted agent that when the Germans thought they had got Yugoslavia in the net, that is to say, after March 20th, they began to move 3 out of the 5 panzer divisions from Romania to southern Poland. The moment they heard of the Serbian Revolution, this movement was countermanded. Your Excellency will readily appreciate the significance of these facts." Stalin received the message with suspicion. In 1940, rumours had circulated in the world press that the British and French armed forces were themselves preparing to invade the North Caucasus and bomb Baku, Grozny and Maikop. Then there appeared documents confirming these rumours. In short, not only the anti-Soviet and anti-communist views and utterances which Churchill never bothered to conceal, but also many concrete facts relating to diplomatic activity, could have prejudiced Stalin against information from Western imperialist sources. The spring of 1941 was marked by a new wave of false rumours in Western countries about large-scale Soviet war preparations against Germany. The German press raised a howl about them and complained that such information tended to throw a cloud on German-Soviet relations. "Don't you see," Stalin would say, "they are trying to frighten us with the Germans and to frighten the Germans with us, setting us one against the other." As to the non-aggression pact concluded with Germany in 1939, at a time when our country might have been attacked on 2 fronts, by Germany and Japan, there are no grounds to think that Stalin had any illusions about it. The party's Central Committee and the Soviet government were aware that the pact did not relieve the USSR from the menace of fascist aggression, but enabled us to win time in a bid to strengthen our defences. Moreover, it hindered the emergence of a united anti-Soviet front. At any rate, I never heard Stalin express any reassuring views with reference to the non-aggression pact. On May 5, 1941, Stalin addressed students of Red Army academies at a reception held in honour of the graduates. After congratulating them on ending their studies, Stalin dwelt on the changes that had taken place lately in the army. "Comrades," he said, "you left the army 3 or 4 years ago. Now when you return to its ranks, you won't recognise it. The Red Army is nothing like what it was a few years ago. We have built a new army and provided it with modern weapons. Our tanks, planes and artillery are different now. When you return to the army, you will see many innovations." Stalin went on to characterize the changes in the different arms and services. "You will come to your units from the capital," Stalin continued. "Red Army men and commanders will ask you what is happening now. Why has France bowed in defeat? Why is England suffering defeat and Germany winning? Is the German army really invincible? Military thought in the German army is advancing. The army has the latest weapons and equipment. It has been trained in new ways of warfare and has acquired great experience. It's a fact that Germany has the best army, both in weaponry and in organisation. But the Germans are making a mistake if they think that their army is an ideal, invincible army. There are no invincible armies. Germany cannot hope for success under slogans of aggressive, predatory war, under slogans of conquering other countries and subduing other peoples and states. Speaking of the causes of Germany's military successes in Europe, Stalin touched on the attitude towards the army in some countries, where due concern for the army was lacking and it received no moral support. It was then that a new morale appeared, corrupting the army. The military began to be regarded with contempt. The army should enjoy the concern and love of the people and government. This is the army's greatest moral force. The army should be cherished. The military school must and can train the commanding personnel only with new weapons and equipment, and make wide use of the experience of modern war. After briefly outlining the tasks of gunners, tankmen, flyers, cavalrymen, signalsmen, and infantry in a war, Stalin emphasized that we must repattern our propaganda, agitation, and press. To prepare well for war, Stalin said, it is not enough to have a modern army, it is necessary to prepare politically. What conclusions, then, follow from the cited facts? How is one to assess what was done before the war, what we were about to do, and what we did not have time to do or were unable to do to strengthen our country's defences? How to make that appraisal today, after everything that we've gone through, looking critically at the past, and at the same time going back once more to the time shortly before the outbreak of the Great Patriotic War? It seems to me that the country's defence was managed correctly as regards its basic and principal features and orientations. For many years, everything, or almost everything possible, was done in the economic and social fields. Regarding the period from 1939 to the middle of 1941, the people and the party applied special efforts to strengthen the country's defences. Our advanced industry, the kolkhoz system, universal literacy, the unity of nations, the moral strength of the socialist state, the people's great patriotism, and the party's Leninist leadership, all of this uniting front and rear, was a powerful foundation for our immense country's defence capability, the original source of the great victory won in the fight against fascism. The fact that, despite enormous difficulties and losses during the 4 years of the war, from July 1941 to September 1945, Soviet industry turned out a colossal amount of armaments, more than 825,000 guns and mortars, nearly 103,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, and over 134,000 military aircraft, shows that from the standpoint of military defence, the foundations of the economy had been laid correctly, dependably, and in good time. Tracing once more in my mind's eye the development of the Soviet armed forces from the days of the Civil War, I would say that we mostly kept to the right road. There was constant improvement along the right lines in Soviet military doctrine, the principles of educating and training the troops, the weapons of the army and navy, the training of command personnel, and the structure and organisation of the armed forces. The morale and fighting spirit of the troops, along with their political consciousness and maturity, were always exceptionally high. Of course, if it were possible to go over that whole road once again, there are some things it would have been better not to do, and some things that would have to be straightened out. But today, I cannot name a single major trend in the development of our armed forces that should have been written off, jettisoned, or repealed. The period between 1939 and the middle of 1941 was marked, on the whole, by transformations that gave the Soviet Union a brilliant army, which readied it well for defence. I write this not to disclaim part of the responsibility for the deficiencies of that period. Every sensible person will realise that even in the high post of Chief of General Staff, it was impossible to achieve much in 4.5 months. I have already spoken of some of my mistakes, and will speak of others in due course, but the important thing to me is to help the reader, especially the young reader, to grasp the true state of things. History gave us too small a period of peace to get everything organised as it should be. We began many things correctly, and many other things we had no time to complete. Our miscalculation regarding the possible timing of Nazi Germany's attack had a telling effect. It lay at the root of the flaws in the preparations to repulse the first enemy onslaught. The positive factors I have mentioned acted constantly, developing more broadly and powerfully throughout the war. It was they that brought victory. The adverse factor, the miscalculation of time, gradually lost its force, but it accentuated the enemy's objective advantages, added to them some temporary advantages, and thus caused the difficult situation in which we found ourselves at the beginning of the war. In 1940, the party and government took a number of additional measures to strengthen the country's defence. However, the economic potential did not permit us to carry them out in full in such a short time. The war caught the country in the stage of reorganising, re-equipping and retraining the armed forces, in the stage of building up the necessary mobilisation stores and state reserves. The Soviet people were not planning for war. They were striving to avoid it, putting all their efforts and resources into implementing their peaceful economic plans. During the time the dangerous military situation was ripening, we army leaders should probably have done more to convince Stalin that war with Germany was inevitable in the very near future, and that the urgent measures provided for in the operational and mobilization plans should be implemented in all haste. Certainly these measures would not have guaranteed complete success in repulsing the German onslaught, because the strength of the two sides was far from equal. But our troops could have gone into action better organized, and could consequently have inflicted much greater losses on the enemy. This is borne out by the successful defence operations of units and formations in the Vladimir Volinsky, Rava-Ruskaya and Peremyshl areas, and at other sectors of the southwestern direction. Today, there are different versions about whether we knew the exact date the war would begin and the German war plan. I cannot say precisely whether Stalin was correctly informed, whether the day the Germans would attack had actually been reported to him. He did not tell me or the Defence Commissar about any important information of this kind that he may have received personally. True, he did say to me one day, "A man is sending us very important information about the intention of the Hitler government, but we have some doubts." Perhaps he was speaking of Richard Sorge, who was then on the staff of the German ambassador in Japan, and about whom I knew nothing until after the war.